Hey, welcome to Grant's Interest Rate Observer of the Air. I'm Jim Grant, and with me today, as always, is our deputy editor, the fabulous Evan Lorenz, Phil Grant, who edits Must Be Read, Almost Daily Grants, which comes out on an almost daily basis, and of course, Eric Whitehead at the controls. Now, gentlemen, today we have some business. We're going to talk at length to Victor Shih, who is a professor who professes, among other things, that China is a big, fat, ugly Ponzi scheme. I'm paraphrasing our president during the campaign. Before we get down to China, Ponziism and the like, I have something to say about Steinhoff. Steinhoff, as you all know by now, is a South Africa-based household products company that has got itself in a pickle. Its CEO has just quit. Their financial irregularities, supposedly, is being investigated, is Steinhoff, by the investigatory body of the South African government, as well, apparently, as by European authorities. The thing is about Steinhoff is that it's got an issue of bonds outstanding, and a part of that issue is in the possession of none other than Mario Draghi himself. Now, I think he's doing business with the European Central Bank, but it's Mario Draghi who has instituted this bond program. It's Shakespeare say, is gross as a mountain, open, palpable. He was talking about lies, Shakespeare, but I'm saying this with respect to this bond buying program. Gross as a mountain. Evan, how much corporate debt has the European Central Bank bought? 129 billion euros.
I think that's right.
Yeah, right. I asked the question, I answered the question. I can't wait for it because I'm so mad about this. All right, so the ECB owning a bit of this security, and these are the, for keeping score at home, these are the Steinhoff 1 7/8 of January 24th, 2025. Now, Evan, what yield would you guess this issue came to market? For a clue, it's rated Baa3, which is kind of 1 foot in junkland, 1 foot in investment gradeville. And it came at a price to deliver,
Well, the U.S. Treasury borrows at 2 and change, so I figure some spread above that, maybe 4 or 5%.
Phil, would you care to hazard?
Well, it is a bull market, so let's shave off a few basis points off of that, and we'll call it 3.5.
Eric is shaking.
He's not sure.
Yeah, no, Eric is going
Speechless.
Yes. Well, you should be, because the Steinhoff 1 7/8 of January 24th, 2025 came to market at 99.444, a price to deliver a yield, I guess, 2% thereabouts. Now, this bond, this Steinhoff 1 7/8 of January 24th, 2025, was doing business in the marketplace at a price of 90 or so.
Just about a week or two ago, yeah.
Yeah, and lo and behold, there are the aforementioned investigations into the this and that alleged irregularity. The CEO who resigned is apparently long a boat full of common shares, heavily margined, and there's some question about a downgrade. Naturally, there would be. So this bond goes from 90-something to 60-something, just like that. It reminds me a little bit of Toys R Us. Right, the security that languidly traded in the summer at about 93 or 94, and there were rumors of so-called restructuring. It was not Toys R Us. And you woke up one morning and it wasn't a 90 number, it was a 20 number, right? I think the bonds went from 90-something to 20-something, which are signs of a not well-tempered capital market, gentlemen, when this can happen to a perfectly, apparently, sound investment-grade security. Somebody's not watching the shop. And to top it all off, the biggest stockholder in this thing is none other than the government employees' pension scheme in South Africa. Great, right? So the working stiffs of South Africa own this security, and the pensioners, and this is a bit of a stretch, they make this comparison, although the South Africans are truly on the hook because the Public Investment Corporation owns a 9.7% stake of Steinhoff, so they're really in the soup. And in Europe, they own a fraction of a fraction of this thing, the bond that is, and it won't even show up on the audit of the ECB if there ever were such I don't know. They audit the ECB? Who knows, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I finished my sermon, but I'm still mad. Yeah.
Well, actually, in a way, the commercial banks in Europe will bear the loss. So the ECB is going to pay off the loss to the banks that make up the ECB, the national central banks. So like the Bank of Finland, the Bank of France, but they charge a negative deposit rate on the banks for excess deposits. So the banks are getting charged a fee that's probably more than enough to actually cover the loss in the security.
Yeah. Well, the Bundesbank, of course, holds the biggest portion of the ECB's capital, so it will bear the principal loss, such loss as there might be. Again, the loss is going to be microscopic in the scheme of things. Mr. Draghi has bought so many securities, this is not going to even show up without a microscope telescope or something, but it is at least illustrative of what can happen when public policy meets credit risk. This reminds me also, it's kind of an echo of something that happened in this country around 1989, 1990. There was a company called Ohio Mattress. I guess it was Sealy, then Ohio Mattress. It was an LBO project of the First Boston Corporation, and woke up one morning and Ohio Mattress was not shipping to Robert Campos, was the owner of the principal, the CEO certainly of a leveraged retailing organization. So one arm of the First Boston Corporation's leveraged business model was not shipping to another because of credit risk on one side, and certainly there was credit risk on the other. Well, anyway, that will complete this somewhat meandering but still impassioned editorial commentary on the state of the world with a polluted, yes, Mr. Draghi, a polluted capital market, and thanks for that. All right. We have today a special guest in Victor Shih, who is an academic who is of this world. He is an associate professor of political economy at UC San Diego, but not that is not in and of itself the proper and great credential, but he's also a student of markets and observer of finance, and he's applied these studies and observations to China. So we're going to talk about China with Professor Shih. Victor, may I affect a friendship and intimacy I only aspire to by addressing you as Victor? Come on. Good. Okay,
yes,
great.
Yes.
Let's get that out of the way.
I am only a professor.
No. See, around here we have a kind of a thing about the PhD standards, we call it, because the Federal Reserve System is overpopulated with aspiring NASA physicists who had to get a degree in economics instead, and they apply their somewhat witchcraft-like expertise. Anyway, enough of that. That's a rabbit hole we have gone down too often. I'm going to ask Evan Lorenz, who is the staff sinologist. Evan also specializes in the Caribbean and South America and Europe and the Antarctic regions, but he is also our sinologist. So, Evan, please address your first question to Victor.
So, Victor, in your most recent paper, you wrote that China's annual debt servicing expense has exceeded incremental nominal GDP every year since 2012. And you write that China as a whole is a Ponzi unit. Is China set up for near-term financial calamity?
So, this is a very tricky question and one that people have asked me for a very long time. I think domestically, they have very few constraints just because the Chinese government controls nearly all the banks in China, and they basically order the banks to roll over the debt of distressed borrowers on a very large scale. So as long as the central bank continues to print money and give it to the banks can continue to roll over the debt of distressed borrowers. So there's no near-term, at least, trigger for a crisis from a domestic perspective. But I think if you look at a larger picture and consider, I would say, even at $3 trillion, China's foreign exchange reserve actually is small. And I can get into why I think that, as well as the rapidly growing external debt of China. I think that's where you find the constraints. I wouldn't say it's a near term, but, definitely risk will get much larger on a 2-3 year horizon.
This episode of the Grants Podcast is brought to you by Morty, M-O-R-T-Y, the newest and smartest way to get a home mortgage. So if you ever bought a home, you know full well how onerous and annoying the mortgage process can be. Painful, time-consuming, phone call intensive, lawyer intensive, not to be experienced. You don't have to. You don't have to. Morty can make it fast and easy. Not only simplifies the process, but they help you find the smartest mortgage that's right for you. Just input your information into Morty's secure website, and less time than it takes to hear this ad, you can shop qualified rates from different lenders. So you can get real loan options in minutes without ever being called or sold by a mortgage broker. You can shop for loans from different lenders, automatically generate a pre-approval letter online for you in minutes, help you speed up the home buying process, and talk confidently to realtors and sellers. So Morty wants to save you money. No commission salespeople, so their experts exist solely to give you the best deal possible. They've got a good customer service team, too, to answer your questions. So whether you're a first-time home buyer or looking to refinance or buying an investment property, head on over to trymorty.com/grant to get started today. That's TryMorty, TRYMORTY, trymorty.com/grant. So Morty Inc. is a licensed mortgage broker, equal housing lender, license number 1429243. Victor, could you elaborate a little bit on this citing about debt service in excess of available cash flow and the Ponzi-like nature of that going back now, 5 years? You begin to wonder how long the long term is. But before we get into the when question, please describe for us the how question. How is it that they do this?
So by my calculation, debt, non-financial debt, that is debt that has been borrowed by non-financial institutions, is now well over 300% of China's GDP. So at a time when rates are rising, and by the way, the PBOC has increased interest rate recently because they are so afraid of capital flight, mainly because they're so afraid of capital flight, but also because they want to sort of give the shadow banking industry a hard time to some extent, then the interest servicing costs of the debtors also has increased quite dramatically. So, you just take a easy round number, and I do it obviously in the paper in a much more careful way, but, let's say if interest rate were 6% today, roughly where it is, at 300% of GDP, that when you have debt that's 300% of GDP, just servicing the interest is 18% of nominal GDP. And this is, of course, happening at a time when nominal GDP is growing at best at 10%. Real GDP is growing at like 6%, 6.5%, but China has inflation, obviously. In reality, actually, the interest rates, the average weighted interest rates of all non-financial debt in China, I forgot what it is in the paper, but it's higher, probably close to the 7%. So then you have, nominal interest servicing that is over 20% of nominal GDP and growth of 10%. So by definition, new credit would have to finance this. Well, new credit, or as someone pointed out, some other sources, savings or something like that, would have to go toward finance just the interest payment. And to me, that makes the entire Chinese banking system sort of a Ponzi scheme, because it is not able to generate new income in the economy to even service the interest payment, which is sort of the classic definition.
Victor, it's a truism, of course, in bookkeeping that for every liability there's an asset, and these debts are someone's liability, but also someone's assets. Who is receiving these interest payments, and what percentage of those recipients are domestic and indigenous, and what percentage external?
So the interest payments are received by mainly the Chinese bank, directly or indirectly. And then, of course, ultimately, so the banks take some of it as its net profit. So do other financial institutions like trust companies and also brokers, increasingly very important players in shadow banking. But of course, because of 30 years of reform, there is now a very wealthy class of investors in China. And the way that savings are distributed in China is very uneven. Like much of the rest of the world, you have 5 to 10% of population that basically has 40 to 60% of all saving China, and they're investing very aggressively, not just in real estate, which is the one that people talk about, but also in a lot of domestic financial products. So in a sense, the higher rate, and someone was telling me this in China, the higher rates in China is really aimed, and also capital control, obviously, are really aimed at bringing the money of this wealthy class of investors whose net worth is, in the tens of trillions of dollars, to keep their money in China, to prevent them from moving the money overseas, because obviously if they were to move their money overseas, I think China would be in big trouble. So I think households, obviously, and also to some extent cash-rich corporations, like some of these IT companies that have raised a lot of money from investors, they are the recipients of this.
Well, Victor, wouldn't
payment.
the Chinese say, if they were here to say it, that we owe it to ourselves?
That is true in some sense.
Well, how much of the debt is owed externally?
Wealthy.
You have that figure, Victor?
Yeah, so it's around $2 trillion. So as a share of total debt in China, which is some large amount, tens of trillions of dollars, it's not big. And people point that out to me a lot, but as a share of all EM, emerging market debt, it's very big. So the amount that China owes to the rest of the world is larger than the combination of Brazil, Russian, Indian external debt, right? So China is a major and massive borrower from the rest of the world. So that is I would say that's a big weakness. I mean, the other big weakness is that, as you guys know more than anyone probably, currency is a liability to the central bank. And China has been increasing its money supply very, very aggressively the past 30 years, really, partly to help growth, but then partly to create a lot of assets, inflate a lot of asset prices to entice this emerging class of wealthy investors to keep the money in China. But if you keep on inflating assets, naturally, this wealthy class of investors will naturally want to diversify some of their money out of China. And increasingly, this natural diversification in itself will cause a lot of capital flight. And then ultimately, if they were to lose confidence in asset prices in China, they're going to want to massively move the money out of China. And I think that is because currency is a liability, that liability is owed to domestic people in China mainly, but it doesn't mean that they don't have an option
Victor,
of moving their money out of China.
So do you see the exchange rate as the biggest risk to China right now? And again, because you pointed out China's...
I do, yeah. It's capital flight, right? So it's not the exchange rate is this weird thing where China is trying to do everything at once because, obviously China can slow down capital flight if it were to devalue its currency, but it doesn't want to do that because, they're afraid that if they were to devalue the currency, it's going to trigger even more capital flight. And then the other thing is that they don't want their nominal GDP in dollar terms to collapse because the leadership wants the Chinese economy to be worth more than the U.S. economy in the near future in nominal terms for this kind of national glory reason. So I think capital flight and exchange rate indeed are big risks in China.
What could precipitate capital flight? And just to go over it, China really has cracked down on capital controls in the last year and a half. So what could actually be the trigger for money to flee China? And could the party actually control it? Because they really have clamped down on a lot of the ways that money has left the country in the last 2 years.
They have, especially the upper middle class now has a very hard time money overseas. But again, I think the weakness is that wealth is very, very concentrated in China. So even if the upper middle class is having a hard time to move money overseas, I think the super wealthy people who are sitting on trillions of dollars of assets can move money out of China if they wanted to. But recently, because the weak dollar and, higher rate within China, at least according to, I don't know that many billionaires in China, but I do know a couple who are related to billionaires in China. And they've told me that actually the weak dollar and also increasing yields of financial products in China have been the main reasons why they have kept the money in China. But if they were to lose faith in that return, then, or, of course, if returns were to get very attractive outside of China, which is a potential. We can talk about the Fed and the potential for multiple rate hikes next year, then that could trigger another round of capital flight. And before people say that, wow, this happened to China already. They lost $1 trillion. They didn't even blink an eye. I would argue that losing $1 trillion was a very big deal for China because in reality, the foreign exchange reserve is not $3 trillion. It's a lot lower than that. So they're truly liquid. So if they were to lose another even $500 billion, then I think they would have some very difficult choices.
Victor, it seems like to us that China was slowing down in kind of late 15 and early 16, and that the party knew that there was going to be the 19th National Congress this year, and we saw kind of lending pick up in 16 and into 17. We saw house prices appreciate. We saw activity accelerate. And a lot of people think that Xi Jinping engineered an economic rebound to put his best foot forward in front of the Congress. Was he able to actually do that? And if so, what does that actually mean for 2018 and 2019 if he's pulled forward demand from those years?
He indeed was able to do that, and his technocrats deliberately engineered an economic rebound.
How did they do that?
I don't think it was that difficult. They did a couple things simultaneously. One is they did begin to crack down on shadow banking and also on the rapidly rising property prices. So they initiated economic growth or accelerated economic growth by relaxing housing policies first in 2015 and increasing the pace of infrastructure investment, both of which, by the way, are financed by debt. So property sales, they relaxed the policies, but then one of the things that they relaxed was mortgages. They lowered down payments in some cases in late 2014, early 2015. So that got things going. But then housing prices were rising so fast fast by the late 2015. So in 2016, they began to crack down on that by, increasing down payment requirements and having like buying restrictions in certain cities, and also some measures to crack down on shadow banking, which was growing very, very fast. So they wanted to engineer. So my friends who was planning this for Xi Jinping actually in China, they wanted a perfect balance of growth of the so-called real economy, which in China means debt finance investment, but then not so rapid growth of financial asset price, stock market, like rapid growth in shadow banking, outstanding shadow bank debt. So they engineered that.
This episode of Grant's Interest Rate Observer of the Air is sponsored by eFinancial Careers, the world's leading financial services career website. So discover career-changing opportunities across the industry from leading brands to niche firms. So why not take the hard work out of job hunting? Just register today and let the recruiters find you. So, create your own profile, create alerts, upload your resume and cover letter to apply for jobs as they are presented on the web. And so check out the site at efinancialcareers.com. That's efinancialcareers.com. Victor, one last thing, if we may. I think that the fundamental insight you have had with respect to the nature of the Chinese enterprise, you call it a Ponzi scheme, because, as you point out, that cost of debt finance is rising at a faster rate than is the nominal GDP with which to service that debt. It's been going on for 5 years, we read in your work, since 2012. This must be among the longest running Ponzi schemes ever. When will it end?
I really think, as I alluded to at the beginning, the big vulnerability is the increase in money supply in China relative to its foreign exchange reserve. So already the foreign exchange reserve is only 10% of money supply in China.
Right.
And with every year, that ratio is going to shrink because certainly the foreign exchange reserve, even if it grows by a couple $2 billion as it has done in the past couple of months, it is nothing compared to the trillions of dollars increasing money supply every year. And to give you a sense, I think this year Chinese money supply will grow by $2.5 trillion in a single year, right? So it's massive. Because the financial system is so massive, because they've tried for so many years to roll over so much debt, the money supply is just massively increasing. And it ends up in the hands of people, right? These very wealthy oligarchs, and they're not stupid, and also they're not powerless. So they're going to want to move their money overseas. They constantly want to do that. So the pressure of capital outflow is really not going to stop. And if you have even relatively minor shocks in relative terms, U.S. and China, or even if it's temporary episode of political panic about what's happening in China, you could see this pretty big wave of outflows, and then China may be forced into a situation of contemplating valuation currency, which then could trigger even more outflows, and ultimately, what people have been anticipating for many years, which is a massive asset price depreciation, which of course will have massive implications for the financial system, because the underlying collateral for much of the credit in the system are land and property. So if land prices and property prices were to collapse, not a true collapse, but even if it were to go down by 30%, it would render a lot of credit in the financial system.
Okay, so Victor, I have only one request. This has been great, and I thank you for it. One request, and that is we just want 2 weeks' notice before it happens. 2 weeks.
2 weeks notice.
Okay.
Right.
You know our number.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Victor Shih. It's been fabulous. Thanks for being on the Grant's Interest Rate Observer of the Air.